Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's edition of Your Turn. I'm Sherre Miller Bishop, your host. And hey, it's a great day if you're above ground and it's cold outside though. Just remember to bundle up. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of the evangelicals and Southern culture on politics. And that's pretty timely because we're in the middle of impeachment hearings, right? We've been polarized, racially polarized, and there's a clear gap between us on a lot of issues. And I was looking at some polls at that, and I just wondered, how does the Southern culture, how does that affect the fabric of politics and how things shake out? And I chose to zoom in on the evangelicals, and I found a guy who is quite interesting and has studied the Southern culture and evangelicals for a long time. Recent polls show us neatly dividing up along gender, racial, and generational lines, and the most troubling split has opened up across the religious line. So we got to talk about that. I went back and pulled some excerpts from a great interview that we had with a professor and minister, and I want to share that with you against the backdrop of where we are right now, because we've been talking a lot about impeachment, but there's a lot of backstory that we're missing, especially as it pertains to religion. Let me share this. According to a 2016 PRRI Brookings poll, 72% of white evangelical Protestants affirm that elected officials could be trusted to behave ethically, even if they have committed transgressions in their personal lives. When compared with a similar survey in 2011, it shows an unbelievable 42-point jump from the 30% who answered differently or similarly just 5 years earlier. Let me read you that stat again. This is a 2016 Brookings poll. 72% of white evangelical Protestants affirmed that elected officials could be trusted to behave ethically, even if they committed transgressions in their personal lives. Now, the question would be, how could such a paradigm shift in opinion be accounted for apart from this political world? You look at some of the things that the Democrats have pointed out as being flaws of Donald Trump, missteps of Donald Trump. How could the evangelical community have been swayed to support that in so many ways? And you saw where former President Jimmy Carter stepped away from the Southern Baptists because he felt that their platform had become unrecognizable for him. Now, conservative evangelical Christianity has long feared attacks from the outside, and what they feared is happening now. We are enduring more of the impeachment hearings, so we're going to talk about impeachment, but I wanted to kind of take a more historical slant at it. I want to pull back from some excerpts from an interview that we had with a political science professor to talk about the impeachment process, but I want to give you a little bit of history too behind some things that I believe may have an impact on the final outcome. And then we'll close out with our political science professor's excerpt from a past interview where he gives his prediction on how things may turn out. Fair enough? Fair enough. Okay. Well, the first thing is, you've noticed that with the temper of our times, when you look at what's going on in politics, what's going on with the evangelicals and our racially polarized society, I went back to look at a couple of things. There's a book called The Sacred Mirror. The full title is The Sacred Mirror, Evangelicalism, Honor, and Identity in the Deep South, 1790 to 1860. And this book is a phenomenal piece. Robert Elder is an assistant professor of history at Valparaiso University. He authored this book back in 2016, and it's an interesting piece because you notice how it's been kind of strange, the way in which evangelicals stand on the word of God, but yet some of the things that they've been supporting and doing and turning a blind eye to have kind of given them a black eye in some areas. So this book, written by Robert Elder, he actually deals with that. He talks about the histories of Southern evangelicalism between the Revolution and the Civil War. And they usually hold to a kind of historical version, kind of with an old Puritan narrative. What do I mean by all of that? Well, in the modern version, he talks about how early evangelicals initially challenged, get this, they initially challenged both slavery and this honor culture among white Southerners. Honor culture. Keep that thought in mind. But then something shifted. There was a paradigm shift. Sometime around 1820, they sold their birthright as social radicals for a mess in order to win and influence souls, especially, what souls you ask? White male slaveholding souls. And one historian in his book, he quotes, says, Southern whites came to speak the language of Canaan as evangelicals learned to speak with a Southern accent. Let me repeat that. One historian said, Southern whites came to speak the language of Canaan as evangelicals learned to speak with a Southern accent. So this transition from opposing slavery to accommodating slavery had an interesting twist to it. And so Elder in his book says he set out to move beyond the opposition accommodation argument and try to describe how some other little factors affected that. The language, the practice, and the structure of evangelicalism overlapped and kind of weaved itself into the culture back in the first half of the 19th century. So put all of this evangelical stuff against a backdrop of what's going on with the impeachment, and it gets to be quite interesting. But here's a little nugget that I discovered. Okay. Elder, you can probably go on Amazon and find this book, by the way, The Sacred Mirror, Evangelicalism, Honor, and Identity in the Deep South. It's by Robert Elder. Think of an elder of a church. Okay. But back to my point. Elder brings up a great point that illustrates how complex this whole thing about the thinking of the evangelicals and how this might affect how white Southerners and other radicals might feel about and how they might vote, or how the legislators who are part of the legislature, some of them are legislators, of course, let's be real, but also how the public support will impact all of this. So again, looking at the evangelicals, Elder says that nothing illustrates this complexity about the language and the structure and how the European perspective affects this. He says nothing clears this up than a story told by Methodist minister William Capers. William Capers was a Methodist minister. And that's part of my little discovery. I'm excited. William Capers became Bishop Capers. And Capers Memorial CME Church, right off of Charlotte Avenue. I believe this is the same person that was named for Capers Memorial right here in Nashville. Okay, so Methodist minister William Capers tells a story in Elder's book. And in his autobiography, Capers vividly describes an incident that occurred at one of the small backcountry churches that lays along his circuit in the Chester district of South Carolina back in the first decade of the 19th century. Now Capers was an advocate for doing missionary work and working with slaves. So Capers, at one of his stops, a place called Carter's Meeting House, a large congregation had gathered, composed of members of the local Methodist Society as well as the local community. All of them were interested in the church trial of a woman accused of adultery, which Capers conducted according to the Methodist mode of government. As Capers remembered, he says, her father-in-law and the connections on that side generally believed her to be guilty, while the woman's husband loudly and pitifully proclaimed her innocent, being, as Capers thought, partially deranged by the shame of the situation. All the community, including the society members, were intensely enlisted on one side or the other of this matter. And when a group of society members chosen by Capers found the woman guilty, the crowd erupted into violence. In the midst of the fight, here it is, Capers saw several society members doing their part and the poor crazy husband fighting his father. Elder says this story is a striking example of the way that the practice of church discipline in evangelical churches throughout the South intersected with the concerns of honor, shame, and reputation. And this was not an accidental or isolated occurrence. From the 18th century on, evangelical churches worked their way into the fabric of how people lived in the South as public places where community opinion intersected in the form of church verdicts and rumors and insults and reputation. And so a lot of these people that support certain things among the evangelicals seems to be a support for a clash between the trappings of honor and pride and the trappings of male honor. And so it's interesting to watch and see how this relationship of so-called honor, and it's supposed to be deeply rooted in the Bible all at the same time, and that's where it gets complicated. So I just wanted to share that little nugget and to have you think about that, how evangelism and religion, I would venture to say, I don't have any stats to prove it, but I would venture to say that never before in the history of this country have we become so deeply ingrained in a mix of religion. Let me say that a little differently. Never before in history have I seen it where religion has been so ingrained in politics. And the sad part of it, they'll give you this full glass of political water, and those who have a distorted view of democracy will drop one drop of poison into that full glass of political water and then still call it fresh, clean water for the people and by the people. But you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. If you take a clean, full glass of political water and you drop a drop of poison into it, you can still holler God all you want to. It's still poisoned water. The water is still tainted. All right, we're finally going to talk to our guest who's been patiently waiting. Dr. Wayne Flynt, welcome to Your Turn.
Thank you, Sherre.
Good. We're able to hear you loud and clear, and that's refreshing. That's refreshing. We had some problems in the past. Well, as I mentioned to you, in case you just tuned in, you're listening to Your Turn. I'm your host, Sherre Bishop. My guest is Dr. Wayne Flynt. He's an Alabaman. His life's work centers around studying the people of Southern culture, their way of life, their politics, and their religion. He's a Baptist minister. In fact, he delivered the eulogy at the funeral of his friend Harper Lee. And you remember Harper Lee was the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. He is Emeritus Professor of History at Auburn University. And he's had lots and lots and lots to say about Southern culture, and he has written about it. He has a long laundry list of books. And one of them I can't wait to get my eyes on is called Keeping the Faith: Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives. It was actually published in 2011, but it's still hot on the market. So you do want to Google that. It's called Keeping the Faith: Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives. And he's got another one that piques my interest called Poor But Proud, 2001. It kind of goes through his life. Dr. Flynt, let's see, you're in over at Auburn. So Auburn, Alabama, you're that's between Atlanta and Montgomery. What's the nearest big city?
Actually, Montgomery, Sherry, we're about 45 miles from Montgomery, but we're really close to the Chattahoochee River, so we're actually closer to Georgia than we are to Montgomery. And many people here shop in Atlanta because it's only an hour and a half to Hartsfield International and 2 hours to downtown Atlanta. So we're, as you say, almost, not quite midway, but almost midway between the two cities.
Awesome. Okay, well, I was just curious about that because you don't hear a lot about Auburn, Alabama. You automatically talk about Birmingham, Montgomery, and the like. But nevertheless, I have to ask you, in your bio, it talks about how you took care of the eulogy at the funeral of your friend Harper Lee, the famous Harper Lee, author of To Kill a Mockingbird. When you're friends with somebody, you find out little things. And I've heard that Harper Lee, well, the Lees, he and his wife now, they were very private, no nonsense, well-spoken, and well-educated. What little known secrets can you share that you knew about them? I'm just curious.
Sure, you used the right word to describe Harper Lee, which is private. And I constantly compare Harper Lee with my wife, Darty. And actually, I think Harper Lee had a great affection for my wife more than she did me because they were so much alike. They both tend to not say much unless they have something really important to say. They're both private people. And you used exactly the right word because some people refer to her as shy, and some people call her introverted, and she was neither shy nor was she introverted. She was extremely opinionated, and she would tell you exactly what she thought about anyone whatsoever. For instance, there was no one in Alabama she detested more than Roy Moore, our recent and present candidate for United States Senator.
Roy Moore.
so she was very outspoken, but she did not seek out controversy, and she hated publicity of any kind, and she had told me and many other people that she never wanted anyone to write about her in her lifetime, and that she would never cooperate with anyone who was writing a book about her that was going to be published during her lifetime.
And I'm sure you heard that message loud and clear. So when
I did. When she figuratively stamped her foot and looked me in the eye and said, "Don't write about me in my lifetime," I knew that she would come back from the grave and kill me if I did.
So when you wrote A Poor But Proud in some of your other books, you just kind of tap dance around that?
No, I really didn't know her well when I wrote the other books. Actually, our friendship began when her sister, who was a Baptist and living in Eufaula, became our friend, and my wife and I started going down once a month, and we would take her to her favorite soul food restaurant over in Lumpkin, Georgia, and she'd have turnip greens and black-eyed peas and cornbread, and we would sit out on her back porch and talk. And she began to tell us stories about her sister. This was back in the 1990s, 80s and 90s. And it was through her that we first met Harper Lee. And then the three sisters who were very close, both of her sisters were older than she was. She was the youngest of the four children. And so we got to know her that way. And it was actually only after her stroke in 2006 that we became close, because she came back to Alabama and she was in a nursing home in Birmingham, and my mother was in poor health and lived in Birmingham. So when we would drive up to see my mother, we would go by the rehab center where she was 6 months rehabbing from her stroke, and spend time with her. And then when she went to assisted living in Monroeville, because she never really recovered completely from the stroke, we would drive down to Monroeville for over a period of 9 years. We would go about once a month and spend time with her. And she would tell us stories, and then the stories got longer, and the friendship deepened and deepened and deepened until finally we almost felt like older sister, younger brother, younger sister.
Wow, that is awesome. I think the thing that I can ask you that will kind of swing us into the deepest part of our interview here is, did you ever talk with Harper Lee, again, author of To Kill a Mockingbird? That story, the setting of that story, the plot of that story, all of that centered on equality and race and racism. And did he ever talk to you about what inspired him to write that book, especially back then during pretty much the peak of some of what was going on then, which we're starting to see now?
Yes, she did, Sherry, and I'm glad you asked that, because actually she wrote another book, which was published only 9 months before she died. The first book she wrote was called Go Set a Watchman. And in that book, the setting is still in what is now Monroeville, but called Macomb. And she has left Alabama, as in fact she did leave Alabama when she was only 23 in 1949. She was born in 1926 and was at the University of Alabama in law school when she decided she didn't want to practice law. She wanted to write, like her friend Truman Capote, who was already in New York City. So she left at 23 and went to New York City. And so she processed the first stages of the Civil Rights Movement in New York City, not in Alabama. So Brown v. Board, 1954, and the second Brown decision in 55, the Montgomery bus boycott in 55, 56, all of that she processed in New York. And her first book, which was published only a few months before she died, was about this young woman from Alabama who goes back to her hometown, and she's 26 years old, and she's furious at her father because she finds out that her father has joined the White Citizens Council. So is his law partner, who was her fiancé. And they explained that, they really don't believe in all that nonsense, but
In case you just tuned in, you're listening to Your Turn. I'm Sherre Miller Bishop. We're speaking with Dr. Wayne Flynt, Dr. James Wayne Flynt. He is University Professor Emeritus at Auburn University in Alabama, and he has studied Southern culture and Southern religion and evangelism for years. We'll be right back. If after watching a bunch of home improvement shows you realize, I hate my kitchen, I hate my bathroom, well, I must warn you, you need the right person to make your home improvement project a reality and to have it done well. You need a craftsman. You need Jeff R. Jeff R. renovated a mid-century home, and just look at the beautiful before and after of this work. You can have your cabinets restored. You can have your floors restored. Your hardwood floors can be brought back and given new life. Or don't have hardwood floors? Jeff R. can replace your hardwood floors. You can have a custom island or bar built. Jeff R. is who you need for your home improvement project to make it simple and easy. Plus, the good news is you don't incur all of the overhead costs from major home improvement builders. Contact Jeff R. He's a craftsman. He'll bring that extra oomph to your project. Look at the beautiful mirror trim on the video that he did with this mid-century home. You can have that extra spark of something unique added to your project when you have the person like Jeff R. He's a craftsman. Contact him. You dream it, he'll design it, he'll build it, he'll show up on time, and you won't have all those major overhead costs, and he'll be honest with you on the front end. Contact Jeff R. 615-589-3667. That's 615-589-3667. And we are back. Against the backdrop of all the impeachment hearings, I thought we'd take a look today at evangelism, or the evangelicals rather, and Southern culture and Southern politics to see how that impacts what people think, how people vote, and whether or not it might have an indirect impact on the impeachment hearings. We're talking with Dr. Wayne Flynt. So, Dr. Flynt, what changed your mind about race?
Early on, when I was a young Baptist preacher and growing up in a segregationist family, what changed my mind about race was not going to college. It was reading the Bible. I just could not read the Bible and believe that segregation and apartheid was the biblical way or the Jesus way. And yet I considered myself to be a white evangelical. I was preaching all the time. I went to a Baptist college, Samford University in Birmingham, where many Nashville students, white students, attend or come from. And while I was there, I became much more convinced that there was no way I could reconcile the Bible to segregation. And keep in mind that I started college in '58 and finished college in '61. And it suddenly dawned on me in 1961, when I was minister of youth at my home church in Anniston, Alabama, that no church was going to call me to preach or be on the staff if they asked me a question about race. If they asked me about a question about race, I was going to be disqualified from virtually every Southern Baptist church and certainly every major church in the South of any denomination. So I decided to go to graduate school, and I thought, well, by the time I finish graduate school and my PhD in 1965, this will have all changed, and I'll be able to preach with integrity. And of course, I finished my doctorate in 1965, and that was, of course, the terrible period when 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed in Birmingham, where I'd gone to college in 1963. The Voting Rights Act was passed the very month I went back to Birmingham to teach at my alma mater, Samford, in 1965. And one of the first things I did, we had a new baby, but as soon as I could, we started a tutoring program at an all-black high school in a very affluent suburb called Homewood, south of the city. And that very affluent neighborhood had a ghetto in which blacks lived within Homewood. And the high school, Rosedale, did not have a single microscope. It didn't have a chemistry class. It didn't have a physics class. It didn't have a foreign language class. And so with students from the Young Democrats, which I organized at Samford, we and students also from the College of Education, we began tutoring. Some would tutor kids who were way behind skill level for their grade, and I tutored kids who were college-bound but had real deficiencies. And in fact, the first African-American co-ed at Samford University was a graduate of our Rosedale tutoring program and went on to head the program in educational television for Alabama A&M University in Huntsville. Elizabeth Sloan, one of the students I'm most proud of, because you can imagine what she went through as the first African-American female living in a dormitory on a all-white Baptist campus in 1969. It was
exactly. That has to be awesome.
I organized voting rights, voting registration in Homewood, in that same Rosedale community, and then I took the Young Democrats and I took voters to the polls, many of them for the first time in their lives in 1968 when they voted.
How scary was that then? Were you in any danger?
No, not really. I had a confrontation because there was a 90-year-old woman that I had taken to register, and when I took her to vote in a presidential election for the first time, I wish you could have seen her. She was dressed to the nines. She had on a hat. She had on her best clothes. Didn't have a car, so I picked her up and took her to vote in Homewood, and there was a long line of white people and almost no blacks because, of course, blacks were just beginning to register in Alabama. Less than half the blacks who were eligible were registered then. And I noticed that people were looking at me as if, I was some invader from outer space or some Yankee.
I can imagine then a white male and then there's this little black lady and you're going in to vote. Like, really?
Cute as pie, just absolutely radiating. Smiling at everybody, just wonderful. And when she got up to the table, the registrar said, sign your name right here. And she said, well, I don't know how to sign my name. And that's the first time I realized that she couldn't read and she couldn't write. I mean, we had just talked. And so the woman looked up at her and really a huff because there was a long line of people behind us. And he said, well, if you can't write your name and you can't read the ballot when you pull the curtain and then pull the levers on a candidate, then you can't vote. And at that point, I mean, her face, she was just smitten. It was just like she was going to cry. And I said, I beg your pardon, but that's not true. Well, since I was not the one she was talking to, she said, well, I didn't ask you. And I said, well, I'm with her. I brought her here. And the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 dealt particularly with this issue because of the long tradition of underfunding black schools in Alabama. And the truth of the matter is, you're incorrect. She doesn't have to sign that. She can make her X, and I can verify that she is who she says she is and her address. And she said, well, you're creating a disturbance, and if you keep this up, I'm going to call the Homewood police. And boy, that really made me furious. So I said, well, you can call the Homewood police, and while you're at it, there are federal registrars all over Alabama guaranteeing that this first presidential election after the passage of the Voting Rights Act will provide an opportunity for all African-American registered voters to vote without any kind of restraints. And I said, I can guarantee you that I will be out of the Homewood jail before you're out of a federal penitentiary when the federal registrars get through with you. At which she was just completely confounded. And she said, well, I'll let you go in with her and show her how to vote, but I want you to know I don't like this sort of thing. And I said, ma'am, I really don't care whether you like this kind of thing or not. The world has changed. So that's the only reason.
You were a rowdy person back then.
24-year-old feeling my oats.
Our guest, in case you just tuned in, is Dr. Wayne Flynt. He is emeritus professor of history at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama, and he's had a lot to say about Southern culture, Southern religion, and he's written about it. His life's work centers around studying the people of Southern culture. Dr. Flynt, right before the break, I talked about how people always ask, why aren't people of color, well, blacks and whites, why aren't they worshiping together? And of course, you know that in history, blacks weren't allowed at the white churches, except for they sat like up in a balcony in the southern churches. There was like a little balcony up there. And even the theaters, there was a back door. And so the separation didn't begin with African Americans.
No, you're absolutely right, Sherry. As a matter of fact, in Alabama and other states as well, there are actually laws on the books in the antebellum period that required that at least one white person be present anytime an African American preached. And obviously that was to monitor what they said, because they might misinterpret something, say like Moses and the Exodus, to be what happened when you crossed over into Freedom Land, across the Ohio River and ran away. So the idea of monitoring African American religion, they discouraged African Americans preaching to other African Americans. There were places where that was violated in Alabama, that law, especially when you had a relationship of civility and kindness between a master and a slave. And perhaps there was a slave preacher that they really respected and liked, and so they just said, well, you go on and preach, and they didn't monitor them. But that was the exception, not the rule. So the idea was that if religion is like the passage in Romans 8, where Paul said, obey the laws and keep quiet and don't challenge the system, and reference to let slaves be slaves and free be free. Well, that was all in a Roman world where if you abdicated the abolition of bondage and slavery, it would have resulted in the destruction of Christianity. The Romans would have killed everybody.
Exactly.
And so what Paul was saying was not like the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, said in an article he published in which I refuted in an op-ed column. Sessions was saying, well, what you're supposed to do is do what the law says, even if the law is unjust, to which I responded, well, that's passingly strange, because if you read about Paul in the New Testament, no one was arrested by the Romans for breaking the law more than Paul, because he refused to obey the Roman law not to preach, and he preached all the time, and finally that's what got him imprisoned in Rome and finally executed by the Roman government. So he gave his life basically violating laws which restricted his moral conscience. And what happened with the black church is that after the Civil War, all of a sudden the white churches said, well, why don't you come to our church, as long as you'll accept the fact that there are white deacons and no black deacons, and white pastors and no black pastors, and white Sunday school teachers and no black Sunday school teachers. Well, of course, African Americans were building their own communities, and as you well know, in many places in the South, the minister of a church was the most important leader of the community, not just religious leader, but usually he read or write because he could read the Bible. He oftentimes created what is really social ministries of uplift to help members of his congregation. There would be freedom schools long before there were public schools. Everything that was in the black community was in many ways presided over, or at least greatly influenced by, the preachers.
And you're exactly right about that. You're exactly right about that. It did center around the church. Even if somebody was looking for a job, they talked to the pastor to give them a reference. When it came to not only jobs, but if something was going on in the community, the black church kind of led that. So even since the Civil War, the black churches have been involved in politics. Were white churches as involved in the politics then?
Oh, up to their earlobes, and oftentimes racist ways of involving. That is, they would try to mobilize whites to vote for white candidates. And it's really important to remember that many of the Reconstruction African-American leaders in Alabama and Tennessee and other places were themselves ministers, because they were already well-known. They had reputations. They were respected by African-Americans. And so, like in the Black Belt of Alabama, where the majority population in almost all the counties was African-American in the central and richest part of the state, many of the African-Americans were Republicans, and some of the whites supported them because they wanted a biracial coalition in which they could participate as planners and wealthy people. And so what you had was actually a biracial Republican Party, and many African Americans who were part of that and elected and served in the legislature. Many of them were ministers. And so from the very beginning, the African American church was a church that was really concerned about liberation theology, and Exodus was a central theme, just like in the period before the Civil War. And then it was from the black church that you got many of the political leaders during the Civil Rights Movement. If you think about Ralph David Abernathy at First Colored Baptist Church in Montgomery, Martin Luther King at in his
Ebenezer,
church, Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, just one after another. Andrew Young's wife was from a very prominent family in Perry County, Alabama, religious family. The Child family, which became famous in medicine and college administration in the North when they left. So there is this long tradition, and the way I try to describe it to students at university when I taught was that the African American church served the African American community in the same way that the white church served the white community. And that's one reason why you didn't have a lot of whites going to black churches or blacks going to white churches, because what they were hearing was not music to their ears when they went to a different church. And as Dr. King said, the most segregated hour in America is 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and that's just as true in 2019 as it was then. The Southern Baptist Convention has a handful of African American churches, and some churches allow black members, but the average Southern Baptist church does not have any black members, and that's the reason my Baptist church, Auburn First Baptist, which is the oldest church in the region, withdrew from the Southern Baptist Convention, because we have lots of African Americans and Nigerian students especially who come to Auburn University and have been a large part of our worship, and all the way back to the 1960s. We had the first biracial early childhood center. And finally, we just decided that the racism in Southern Baptist life, they may not preach it, but they certainly live it in Southern Baptist life. And so
we're back to if it looks like a duck and acts like a duck.
And tweets like a duck, it's a duck. And we feel much more comfortable in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which Jimmy Carter founded, and I was present at one of the first meetings, which was at 6th Avenue Baptist Church, the church that was, 16th Street Baptist Church, which was bombed in Birmingham, and about half the people participating in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship organization were African Americans, and about half were white, and Jimmy Carter was sitting right there on the front row, along with my deacon wife, Darty, next to him.
Wow. So with all this separation with the churches, it looks like you're pretty hard pressed to find a lot of youth in church now, especially the millennial population. Why are they leaving in droves, or not coming at all?
40% of millennials, when asked what their religion is, say none. So we're losing an entire generation of millennials, and I don't blame them. A lot of people blame them because they say, well, they're hedonistic, fun-loving, sexually active. Actually, that's not true. They're sexually less promiscuous than they were a generation ago. But what does strike them is what strikes me, which is, for instance, the church of my childhood, the Southern Baptist Convention, is, in my opinion, morally, ethically, biblically, and intellectually bankrupt. 81% of white evangelicals in the United States voted for Donald Trump, who is arguably the most amoral, hedonistic, narcissistic, xenophobic, misogynist. He doesn't like women. He doesn't like immigrants. He doesn't like blacks. He preaches a racist agenda for the nation. I don't understand how you can say you're a Christian and you follow the way of Jesus, and then you support Donald Trump. I think that's totally contradictory.
How did we get him as our president? Everyone today claims to be very religious. Even the evangelicals, they preach a very traditional platform, and it seems like the two issues that kind of create a dividing line. One is abortion. That's a big issue. They are pro-birth, but they're not pro-right. They want the babies born, but they don't give a darn about them after they're born. But that's another long story. In the meantime, phone lines are open. You got 15 minutes. 615-242-7760. That's 615-242-7760. In such a society today that's supposed to be so religious, how do we get Donald Trump as our president?
You're absolutely right, Sherry, and I think that it's important to realize that you follow the way of Jesus and you follow the way Jesus taught, but then you interpret everything you read in the Bible in ways that reflect your own values. And for instance, just to give you two great examples of this, I think white evangelicals in America have reduced the way of Jesus to two things: opposition to same-sex marriage and opposition to abortion. And as you say, they say, well, we protect the right to life and children. No, you don't. Alabama, if you look at any category of child poverty, child mortality, maternal mortality, poverty, undereducation, obviously what white Alabama Protestants love is fetuses. They don't love children. Once a fetus becomes a child, there's no place where you'd less like to live than in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Those are the worst places in America for a child to grow up. In Oklahoma, I forgot that. And so to say you love children is not true. What you do is you love fetuses. So that's the first part of it. Then the second part of it is I'm kind of a Bible scholar. I read it every morning. I'm making my own commentary. And you know two subjects about what Jesus never spoke, not a single word in any of the four Gospels: abortion and same-sex marriage. Now, he talked about divorce. He talked about jealousy. He talked about backbiting. He talked about lying. He talked about not taking care of strangers. He talked about not taking care of the sick and elderly and orphans and widows. And he talked about all those things. But he did not say one word about abortion and not one word about same-sex marriage. So how is it that we have turned white evangelical religion in America about two issues? And I realize people can come to different conclusions about same-sex marriage and abortion. But I would just point out that one of the things Jesus did say in Matthew 7:1 in the Sermon on the Mount was, "Judge not that ye be not judged, for with which judgment you judge, you shall be judged." Or to put it another way, everybody has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And when we start judging each other, we automatically say, well, your sin is a lot worse than my sin. So I have a right to judge you because I'm not as sinful as you are. Jesus never taught that. Not a single place did Jesus teach that. Jesus said, you have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Therefore, don't judge each other. You know who's going to judge us? Jesus Christ. God is going to judge us. And when we get to judgment, I don't worry about what people in the First Baptist Church of Auburn are going to say about me.
How do you define evangel?
I tell you, the way we're acting in our public life, I wouldn't want to be judged right now.
Exactly. How would you define evangelicals now? Because now, when I hear the word evangelical, the first thing that pops in my mind is conservative.
I was growing up, Sherry, in the Southern Baptist Convention, they avoided the term evangelical like it was a sin. And the reason is because it was associated with groups that they didn't particularly like Pentecostals and holiness people. Think what you will about them. But at any rate, Southern Baptists said, oh, that's not us. We're not evangelicals. And then all of a sudden there was a period when it seemed like anybody who witnessed to somebody else about their faith and tried to lead them to faith in Jesus Christ was automatically just grouped as evangelical. And I've talked to some friends of mine who do political polling, including in Alabama, a friend, for instance, from the University of Pennsylvania. And she was in Alabama during the last election, and she said, you know, I asked people in exit polls, are you an evangelical? And she said they looked at me like they didn't have any idea what I was talking about. And that's because the average Southerner has no idea what you mean when you say, are you an evangelical? If you say, are you a Baptist, they know, but they don't know what an evangelical is. And then she changed and asked, do you consider yourself a born-again Christian? And all of a sudden they knew exactly. And she said, I never got someone who was confused about being a born-again believer in Jesus Christ. I like that term. That's the first Christians in Acts were called people of the way because they followed the Jesus way. I like that. And I wish we'd say that's what we are, because white evangelicals is just a group I don't want to be identified with anymore.
Speaking with Dr. Wayne Flynt, Professor Emeritus of History at Auburn University, and he is a wealth of knowledge. He's a think tank when it comes to Southern culture and Southern religion. You know, Dr. Flynt, I was in, this has been some time ago, but I was in a place like a banquet where people were eating a type of chicken. And usually with chicken, you know, you can pick it up and bite it, you know, if it's on the bone. And everybody seemed a little bit awkward because it was a dressy affair and nobody was comfortable with the idea of picking up the chicken. Where one person who was seated in a very visible place, and stay with me, I'm going somewhere with this. Someone that was in a visible position finally stopped with all the nonsense with taking the fork and the knife, trying to cut portions of the chicken off. And she picked her chicken up and she started to eat her chicken leg. She picked her chicken up in her hand. After that, everybody else did that because someone who was respected in the room did that. And they figure, well, if she knows etiquette, then it's okay to do that in this setting. Where I'm going with this is Donald Trump has done and said some things publicly and not hid a lot of his views on a lot of things, like calling the S-hole countries and sort of baiting people into these arguments on different things. And even after what happened in Charlottesville, when they had the tiki lamps and all of that, torches and all those things going on, and he said, well, there were some bad people on both sides of the situation. So he didn't take a definite position on situations and opportunities when he could have. My question is, do you think that just like that chicken story I just gave you, that when someone who is in a leadership position does something and that tells everybody else that it's okay to do that, do you think that that has what has happened with Trump, with the rise that we're seeing with racial polarization in our country?
Absolutely. And just to put this in the context of religion, Sherry, of course, we are expected to call out people who are racist. Jesus called out people who were, and no better example of this than the Samaritans, but he called out people who were bigots all the time. And in the 25th chapter of Matthew, when he talks about when you get to heaven, what's the final examination going to be like? And he says, did you feed the hungry? Did you visit the widows and orphans? Did you visit the prisoners? Did you take care of the sick? Did you welcome strangers in the land? That is, his final exam will exclude Donald Trump. Donald Trump will not be in heaven because the final exam is in the 25th chapter of Matthew, and he fails because all he is about is himself. He is a narcissist. And I think one of the things that bothers me is that the role of leadership is a role of courage, and it is a role of prophecy, like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah in the Old Testament. And the result of that is what we have now is a leader who says what he said about Charlottesville, but in Greenville, North Carolina last week, he first said, well, I feel uneasy about them shouting, send her back to a Somali refugee. But on the other hand, the next day, he said, well, they were really good people. Those people in Greenville were really good people. Well, they can't be both. They can't be shouting a racist.
Well, first he said that he didn't say it.
And saying, stranger, get out of the land. When Jesus said, welcome the stranger to the land, you can't be both. Either they're wrong and you call them out because that's not the Jesus way, or because you don't know the Jesus way and you don't care about the Jesus way. All you want to be is electable to white evangelicals who have decided that Christianity is all about abortion and same-sex marriage. So I have no respect for him, none whatsoever. I would vote for any Democrat on the ballot, though I don't like Joe Biden myself, but I would vote for any Democrat because I believe any Democrat would be closer to the teachings of Christ, if not in their personal beliefs, than Donald Trump would be.
We got a few more minutes left. Where is our light in terms of the political economy? Because I want to be fair. I try to put out objective information or ask objective questions. I'm just trying to figure out with our current president, I've heard my husband always says there's always another way of doing things. It doesn't have to be your way. There's always another way. So Trump is doing things in a different way. My question is how is that way the right way when we're looking and seeing so much corruption? Because when you bring that up to Trump supporters, then they say, well, there was corruption in the Obama administration.
Yeah, well, the argument that, well, there was corruption in the previous administration is what in debate we used to call a red herring. That is, when you don't have an answer to an argument, what you do is get a smelly fish you just caught and pull it across the trail so they can't smell the story anymore. The truth of the matter is, it doesn't make any difference whether there was corruption in early administrations. That's terrible, and I wish it hadn't existed, and I wish somebody had found out about it and that people had gone to jail. That's not the point. Previous administrations are previous. They don't exist anymore. So the question is, what is happening in his administration? And my first books were written on Southern politics, so I'm basically a 20th century American political historian. And what I would say is that this is the most amoral, most unethical administration in American history, along with Ulysses S. Grant's administration and Warren Harding's administration and Franklin Pierce's administration. This is in the top 5 of the most corrupt administrations in the history of the United States, and it is certainly among the top 5 in terms of ineptitude. He doesn't care anything about government. He doesn't know anything about government. And every day that passes with the repetition of firing one cabinet member and replacing, we've had more turnover in the cabinet in his first 2.5 years than in any administration in American history. So, he's inept. He is a pathological liar. He's a serial adulterer. And he is the darling of white evangelicals. Now, who can figure that out?
Wow. Caller, it's your turn.
Well, praise the Lord. I just wanted to call in and thank the young man for coming in for calling in today. Really, certainly enjoyed what he had to say. I appreciate him telling the truth. So I didn't want this moment to pass by without me saying I really appreciate him coming in, calling in today and telling the truth.
Well, I guess you're being heard loud and clear, Dr. Flynt.
I think I heard from a brother then. We're not the same color, but he's my brother.
Absolutely. Man, this was awesome.
Thank you, Sherry. It's been wonderful. I enjoyed your questions.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, that's going to do it for today's edition of Your Turn. And in the meantime, remember, be true to the one in the mirror. God made you in his image. Now you go represent. Dr. Bobby Jones is up next. I'm Sherre Bishop. This has been Your Turn. Hey, everybody. Sherre Bishop here, host of Your Turn on 760 AM. I got this dude here, Joshua Monday.
Yes.
And we are at the lab.
Hey,
puts the Tuesday? February the 11th. Put February the 11th on your calendar. We're going to bring some people up in here. We're going to talk about some stuff. We're going to do Your Turn live here.
Yes.
And it's the 1-year anniversary of Your Turn. And all this great stuff at the lab.
yes. So make sure y'all come out February the 11th. We're going to be talking about Jefferson Street, all things Black Nashville. So make sure y'all here, 624 Jefferson Street.
Lift your voice. Speak your truth. Your Turn on 760 AM, The Gospel.